This is David Vogel, and this is myself. So we can officially start the seminar, the Zoom seminar on theories of regulation. Today we have Professor David Vogel with us, well-known scholar of regulation. Actually, my mentors and the mentor of many people, a few more people here in the list. David is emeritus professor from the Haas Business School and the Department of Political Science at the University of Berkeley. He is a scholar of business and regulation, and later on business and politics, and later on the politics of regulation. Is highly cited, highly influential, provocative, original, and does not fit into any kind of theoretical camps or boxes and so on, because he's creative. So it's a pleasure to have you here, David. And today's talk is about the politics of preemptions. It's about American federalism and risk regulation, and we are looking forward to hear from you, David.
Thank you, David. I appreciate this opportunity. So let me begin by just talking about how this project began. A few years ago, I published a book on environmental policy in California. And one of the major parts of California's environmental history involves automobile emissions, where the state, because of pollution problems in Los Angeles, was the first government in the United States to issue automobile emission requirements. The industry opposed those, but eventually came around and said, okay, we recognize California is unique and it's okay. Then New York State decided to also enact its own standards, which were all different than California's. The industry panicked, went to Washington and said, okay, now we've changed our mind. We think that uniform national standards are really important to protect the public health, and we're willing to support them. And in addition, of course, we want to protect the national market. So we want all states to be prohibited from enacting their own standards. We want one national standard. California was very upset about this because it had been there historically and had distinctive problems. And after a long period of conflict, and a compromise was worked out where standards for the other 49 states would be set by the federal government, but one state would be allowed to establish its own standards, California. So basically a partial preemption. I also came across in the book another example, which was on appliance efficiency standards, standards by which you look at an appliance and assess its water use and its energy use. Again, California was a leader, began regulating refrigerators, the first most energy efficient, energy intensive appliance in a particular home. The industry didn't like that, but was willing to put up with it. Then several other states began to regulate appliances. The industry, of course, was upset by the diversity of standards, went to the federal government and said, okay, we're now willing to support uniform standards for appliance efficiency, but again, we want preemption. We want the states to be prohibited from doing so. And a compromise was worked out. So these are very interesting patterns in which you have a story of a state innovation. Industry preferences change from opposing federal regulation to supporting federal regulation. And basically a compromise is federal standards are strengthened, but preemption is also increased. So then I began to look around and say, is this part of a broader pattern? Could we find other examples? And then I came across the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act of which was passed during the last year in 2016. And what's interesting is this is the only extension of health and safety environmental regulation passed by the Republican-controlled Congress during the 6 years of the Obama administration. This is 40 years after the original Toxic Substances Control Act. So what all of a sudden led Congress, this Republican-dominated Congress, to suddenly strengthen toxic chemical regulation in the United States? And the answer is the industry preferences changed. Industry decided that They were really getting upset by the dramatic increase in state regulation, which was creating disruptive markets. A lot of states were much too stringent. And they said, okay, we're willing to support a strengthening of chemical safety standards. In exchange, we want states prohibited from enacting their own chemical standards. We want a single market, essentially, for chemicals. The same year, activists in the US had been fighting for decades for a labeling on genetically modified food and products. The US has been the only country in the world which has no labeling requirements for genetically modified ingredients in food. Suddenly, in 2016, Congress enacts the first labeling requirements for genetically modified food. How did this happen? Well, the industry has successfully fought every state effort to regulate GM foods, GM ingredients, very rigorously, including a referendum in California, which the industry beat. And they were holding their own. Suddenly, the state of Vermont, the little state of Vermont, enacted the country's first standards for GM ingredients. The industry panicked. It did not like this precedent. It did not want to have distinctive standards for Vermont. It went to the federal government and said, we're willing to support national standards, but we want preemption. So on one hand, these four examples have a consistent pattern. But when I looked at them more carefully, what was most interesting about them is the way they varied, which is, say, the patterns of preemption, the extent to which state jurisdiction was compromised, was challenged, was limited, vary significantly in each case. And so this raised two questions, which is the core of this, the research, which is how do we account for these variations? And what difference have they made? And so the core of my contribution to the literature on preemption is to look at the different patterns of preemption and explain why patterns of preemption vary so much and what difference is made in terms of policy. So let me just briefly go through the four cases in terms of the dependent variable, how the patterns of preemption vary dramatically in each of these four cases. So in the case of core emission standards, very distinctive. You have a parallel system of shared governance where California and the federal government have equal authority. They each can set their own standards, one for the other 49 states, one for California. And it's basically a system of a state has enormous autonomy. One state, and only one state though, has enormous discretion to set its own car standards for its own citizens. So that's an interesting sort of story. In the legislation, the industry got preemption, national standards, and the legislation says, but there's an exception if a state has already regulated cars, they can continue to do so. In the case of appliance efficiency, very interesting pattern. The compromise was once the federal government has regulated an appliance, the states can no longer regulate it. But until the federal government has regulated an appliance, the states are free to do so. So basically, you have a moving target, shared governance, where at any given moment, some appliances will be regulated by the federal government and others by the states. And as the federal government regulates more appliances, the state role declines. But of course, as new appliances emerge, then those appliances can be regulated by the states. And the states can have a variety of different standards. In the case of chemicals, it's a complicated story. But basically, new chemicals, when the federal government, existing chemicals, when the government regulates them, the states are preempted. States can regulate new chemicals, and they also have a grandfather clause in that if a state has already regulated chemicals, it can continue to do so even after the new federal regulations come into place. So it's a very complex system. And what was interesting about this and how important it is that this legislation took 4 years of debate before it was enacted. And if you look at the legislative history of this law, the first reform of chemical regulation in America in 40 years, The battle over this law was not about the federal standards, which everyone thought needed to be strengthened. It was about the extent of preemption, a very rigorous battle in which states which had already regulated chemicals insisted that they be allowed to continue to do so. The industry fought very hard for uniform standards, finding state chemical standards very disruptive. And this was a very big battle, and it just gives a sense in which preemption rules have enormous regulatory impacts. In the genetically modified case, this is a classic case of total preemption. Once the federal government has prohibited any state from enacting any regulations on requiring genetically modified foods, ingredients. So we have 4 very different patterns. If you look at automobile emissions, appliances, chemicals, and GM foods, 4 very different patterns of preemption. And although there's a long literature on preemption, which notes that there are different forms, to the best of my knowledge, there's been no effort to sort of explain how come these forms have varied so much. So I developed 4 explanations, which I think explain these different patterns of preemption. So one has to do with scientific credibility. And in this case, the Vermont really stands out. In the other 3 cases, there clearly was a health and safety argument for automobile emission standards, for appliance efficiency, and for chemicals. But there's no real argument that GM ingredient foods pose a health problem, and that consumers really need to know. So basically, the scientific credibility of the risk that Vermont was trying to regulate was much thinner, was much weaker than the risks that the other 3 regulations were trying to do. And I think that really hurt Vermont's case, which is they could not make a credible scientific health and safety argument as to why it was important that the public know about GM ingredients, in quite contrast to the other 3 cases where there clearly was a scientific rationale for regulation. So that's the first explanation. The second has to do with the number of states. Here, California is a little different, but if you look at chemicals, over half the states had regulated chemicals. Far fewer states had regulated appliances, and only 1 state had regulated genetically modified foods. So if you just do like a number of states, it's clear that that has a big impact on how much preemption there is. The third dimension, which I think is very important, is the intensity of state opposition. So when the automobile industry went to Washington in the 60s and said, we want federal standards, we cannot simply have more than 1 standard for the United States on cars, very much like the EU. California really fought very, very, very hard. And it was a very bitter battle in Congress, in which California eventually narrowly won. And so basically there was an enormous outpouring from Democrats, Republicans, 400,000 people wrote a petition. There was a real grassroots movement in the state, enormous pressure on Washington from the state of California. And so, and I think that made an enormous difference in California's getting this very unique situation. The only history in the time of the United States where a specific state has by name been allowed to regulate a product more stringently than the federal government. In appliances, that was a compromise worked out between an environmental group and the appliance industry, and there wasn't much pushback from the states. It's interesting that the first appliance standards issued by the federal government were identical to those in California. And there was a general sense among California and the states is that, thank God, the federal government is finally going to establish efficiency standards for the whole country. And we trust they're willing to do so. And there was less anxiety about the state role being preempted, perhaps somewhat naively. In the chemical case, which is the most fascinating, so here you have a 76 legislation, the Toxic Substance Control Act. From the very beginning, it was very clear that this was a chemical safety standard, which was not being enforced, which was simply a dead letter. The courts overruled it. Its standards were very lax. Basically, under the Federal Chemical Control Act, there's virtually no regulation of chemicals. Only 1 or 2 chemicals are ever banned. There's very few restrictions. There's no testing requirements. Basically, over time, the TSA legislation becomes a dead letter. But public pressure for chemical regulation increases. And what you see is, beginning in California, but spreading to half the country, a huge outpouring of chemical regulation by states. Indeed, for those 40 years, virtually all improvements in chemical safety in the United States were done by American states, not the federal government, because under TSCA, the states were given authority. So when the industry went in 2016 and said, we want federal standards, we want uniform standards, we want preemption, these states went crazy. They said, the only thing that's happened in chemical safety in America is what we've done. And we don't trust you, and you're gonna take this away from us. And there was a big outpouring, a huge battle. And basically, the compromise really was pretty good for the states. Several attorney generals of the states, environmental groups, insisted that new chemicals be regulated by the states. And also, very importantly, it grandfathered existing regulations, unlike in the case of appliances, where once the federal government acts, there's no more states. In the case of the intensity of opposition on chemicals, all the existing state regulations were allowed to continue. So again, you have an enormous backlash against the industry, and on balance, you have a limited amount of preemption. In the case of GM ingredients, Vermont is all by itself. There's only 1 state that has regulated GM ingredients. No other state has done so. Every other state initiative has been defeated by the industry. It's a small, weak state, and basically it's not a big deal. It had no other state allies. It's interesting, of the 4 cases, the only one in which California was not playing a leading regulatory role was GM ingredients, because this big initiative in California was defeated. And so Vermont's pretty sort of helpless, basically it's just unable, the industry rolls over it. And basically you have total preemption, so that no state can touch GM ingredients. Okay, so I think those four patterns, these 4 factors, the number of states, the intensity of state opposition, and the scientific arguments play a role. The final factor is industry preferences. So the car industry, automobile industry, don't forget, in the beginning of this story, there's 2 standards. There's California, and there's nothing for the rest of the country. The industry is prepared to live with 2 standards. In the case of the federal legislation, it still has 2 standards. It has California and the rest of the country. So basically, the car industry, I think, although it fought hard, is willing to, its nightmare was multiple state standards. If it has to come up with 2 standards for the whole country, it can live with that. And so in that sense, I think the compromise was sort of worked out. In the case of appliances, I think the industry fought hard. I think it was not aware of the fact that the states would continue to play a more active role. It wasn't a big deal. I think the industry was most concerned about preemption. And I think it was really not aware, and didn't make a big fuss about the fact that the states would continue to play a role, because I think in this case, the assumption was that the federal government would play an active role and the state role would be ended. So the industry sort of got what it wanted. Chemicals is interesting. The industry did not do well in Washington. It got stricter standards, but it didn't get anywhere near as much preemption as it wanted. I suspect that from the chemical industry's point of view, having a weaker federal standard and having a non-enforced federal standard was more important to them than restricting the state role. I mean, they wanted to restrict the state's role. They made a fuss about it. But in fact, it's not been a bigger deal. The industry is much more affected by the strictness of federal standards and the extent to which those standards have been pretty lax and not enforced. The industry has been okay. In the case of GM foods, it's a very different story. The agricultural producers and the food processors had decided from the very beginning a mandatory label saying this product is made with genetically modified ingredients was the kiss of death. Their nightmare was that this would increase the market share for natural foods, and it would change American agriculture, and people would shun GM products even though they dominate the American food supply. This was seen as extraordinarily disruptive. And the industry was strongly determined that no mandatory label be permitted in the United States. And so they fought every state. And now, having lost to one state, they went to Washington and said, we want preemption. And I think the priority the industry had placed on no GM labels enabled it to triumph. So that's sort of basically 4 explanations as to the variations in preemption. So this raises the other question is, what difference has those differences made, those variations made? And I think the evidence suggests that they've really been very, very important, that the extent of federal preemption has had as much impact on regulatory effectiveness as the government standards themselves. So just to briefly review, the United States has made enormous progress on automobile emission standards. They're about 98% cleaner than they were in the 1960s. This has been the biggest, most important accomplishment of air pollution control in the United States, car standards. And it has been made possible because of the California exemption, because this means that California can continue to regulate. It's not dependent on the federal government. It can innovate, which is very important. And as California, what the pattern is, California innovates and the federal government adopts. So you basically have a state serving as a laboratory of innovation. And what you see is within 2 or 3 years, almost every California standard is adopted by the federal government for the rest of the United States. So this is an example of which a state can make up for the deficiency of federal standards if it doesn't think they're strict enough. And it also can remain a center of innovation, coming up with new policies, which then the federal government can choose to adopt. In the case of appliances, so that's a success story. Appliances is different. Once the federal government has regulated an appliance, the states cannot regulate it. So on one hand, more federal regulation means more appliance efficiency standards. But it also means that it restricts state innovation, because once the federal government has regulated an appliance, the state's hands are tied. And so and the other interesting thing about appliances is you have to keep upgrading the standards in order as technology changes. But the states can have an impact on the federal government standards until it has regulated. So a new standard is first regulated in California, then the federal government will regulate it. But once it regulates it, the states can do nothing. And so therefore, there's many improvements in appliance efficiency, which could take place, but the federal government has not implemented them and no state can implement them. States can only innovate and learn from each other and influence the federal government if the federal government has not yet regulated. And you see this, by the way, very much in terms of climate change, where many states have very rigorous efficiency programs to reduce energy use and thus address climate change issues. And they can regulate the buildings. A major source of emissions in the US of energy use is households, appliances, and buildings. States can regulate the buildings, but they can't touch the appliances in them, to the extent to which the federal government has regulated them. And so you have a lot of appliances in the US which are allowed in buildings, refrigerators, et cetera, washing machines, which could be much more efficient and which states would love to make more efficient, but they can't because of the preemption rules. So that has made had a big impact. In the case of GM ingredients, in a sense, Vermont was a blessing in disguise because the industry used to have to fight state by state to restrict, to prohibit labeling. And once the federal government has preempted, which it did after the Vermont, in response to Vermont, there's no more states. So the issue of GM ingredients has been removed from the United States. The federal government has total authority. It's not going to ever do anything more, and that's sort of that. It's also an interesting case. So this was, I think, a case in which, if you care about GM labeling, preemption has completely taken it off the American agenda. So basically, my sort of argument is that the forms of preemption vary, that we can try to explain why in these 4 cases they have varied, and that most critically, the forms of preemption have important policy impacts, that they matter. And if you look at these 4 cases, it's clear that the extent and effectiveness of regulation has been significantly affected by the balance of power between the federal government and the states. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, David, for this kind of fascinating talk. I don't think this generation have such a scope, the ability to provide historical narrative combining with theoretical and multi-level analysis, and also 4 different spheres or fields of regulation. So from here, I'd like to invite comments, questions from the audience. Who wants to start? I know this is, people will have questions and will want to be engaged in the discussion, but it sometimes takes some time. Yes, Jonathan, please.
Yeah, David, very nice to see you. Thanks for the great.
Jonathan, nice to see you again. You're in Amsterdam?
Yeah, I'm in Amsterdam, yes. So I had a couple of thoughts about your argument. So, I mean, one question is really about the relationship in the calculations of the industry between the number of standards and the stringency of the standards, which seems to play a role. I mean, from your account, it seems like they may have miscalculated what the effect of allowing California to set car standards independently would be, because, I mean, you talked about, in the presentation, you talked about California as a laboratory of innovation, which is then, whose innovations are then adopted by the federal government. But I mean, if I understood your famous California effect, it was also that the industry eventually found that they couldn't, it was not economic for them to produce to 2 sets of standards. So California's more stringent standards also wound up being de facto binding for the whole country. Maybe I've misunderstood.
No,
but
with a time lag.
yeah, I thought that was the answer. Whereas the chemicals case, you have many different states, and that seems to be a different calculation. I wondered there also what role, if any, international standards play. That is, standards like REACH, which could also have, now people, as you know, talk about a Brussels effect, and chemicals is one of the cases in point. So I wonder whether that played any role. And my last thought is, whether, my last question is whether you've given any thought to how this kind of argument applies in the EU. Certainly something that has often been said is that a distinctive feature of environmental regulation in the EU is that under internal market rules, member states can maintain higher standards, and that that is unless the EU has regulated, and that's a force that has driven up the standards in the EU, because so that there's an incentive to agree on higher standards to avoid the states retaining, the member states retaining the right to higher protection. So you don't have a lowest common denominator veto logic in the legislative process, and that has some affinities. It's a reversed version of the dynamic you describe.
Yeah, should I respond, David?
Yes, sure. Please go on.
I think Europe is quite different. I think that the EU is much more restrictive of state regulations than the member state than the US is. I mean, it's a much more fragile market. There's much more concern that those national state regulations will be abused. And so I think the patterns of preemption are much stronger in Europe than they are in the United States. You wouldn't, I mean, look at REACH. It's, European standards. US, lots of state role. Car standards, one for Europe, US has now two. Appliance efficiency standards, they're preempted in Europe. US has still a dual pattern. So the Europeans have been much more focused on uniform standards on preemption than the US has. US states have gotten away with much more. On the chemicals, yeah, I mean, I think lots of different states have played a role. I think the industry has sort of made a trade-off. I think that's right, where it wanted, it was willing to, it wanted more stringent standards, but it was willing to put up with more state regulations. And I do think you're right. There's a relationship between stringency and number of and diversity. So I think those are three important comments. I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Anyone wants to enter? More questions? Henry, please.
Henry.
So we have all the risk regulation persona here.
Well, I saw this seminar was on, so I couldn't miss it. Thanks for that. It's really interesting. Actually, I have a sort of technical question.
I need to hear you louder.
Can you hear me?
A little louder.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yep. It's a technical question, and it's. I suppose I don't know much about the US, so I don't really know what's at stake in whether it's the federal government that regulates something or individual states. And I'm wondering whether there are some key principles here that are being argued over between states, between federal government and the industry and any other kind of stakeholders that are involved, and whether that varies according to the kind of issue that is being discussed. So if it's automobile emissions, I can imagine there are issues about kind of, as you were pointing to, issues of risk. But when it comes to GM labeling, maybe if that's not regarded as a risk, well, maybe then the operation of the principle, whatever it is, plays out rather differently. So I'm just wondering kind of who decides, who regulates?
Well, these are all battles. I mean, in every one of these cases, except for the appliances, these were very, very hard-fought battles. The car issues, the chemicals, the chemical thing took, as I said, over 3 years of fighting. So it's not obvious. I mean, these are political decisions where the industry wants uniform standards, and one or more states resists those efforts, and there's a battle. And the outcomes of those battles have varied significantly in these 4 cases. I mean, California did very well, Vermont, a catastrophe. I mean, Vermont's interesting. The only case, important case in which any existing state Vermont's unlike California, which could keep its own standards, Vermont actually the Vermont regulation was prohibited. It was taken off the books. It was made, once the federal government had preempted. So I think the politics are critical. And I think that's one of my big arguments. There's no principle about it, which is to say, there's just battles over each of these. In the 3 of the 4 cases, there's enormous conflict. And now, of course, on appliances, a lot of the states would like to have more discretion, and they just they can't. So I don't think you can generalize about. I think it's a matter. I mean, it's like regulatory stringency. It's a matter of the politics. But I do think the GM case is interesting. I think because part of the story is that both strong industry pressure, only one little state, and a weaker, a cassis de Jean kind of argument, which is there's no real rationale for a particular state regulation.
But it's not a constitutional principle.
No, not at all. I mean, the only constitutional principle is if a state tries to regulate a product or issues a regulation, and it's done to protect the local industry in that state, the Supreme Court would strike it down. It'd be in violation of the State Commerce Clause. And in these cases, the 3 of the 4 cases, there's no local industry which benefits. In other words, California has no car industry, right, et cetera, no chemical industry, et cetera. So the one constitutional issue is on the Interstate Commerce Clause, if you can allege that a state is discriminating against products made outside the state, it's struck down by the courts. But none of these played into that.
Thank you, David. More questions, comments? Anyone? If not, I'd like to take you, David, to the question of...
We need to raise their hand.
Who's that? Ronit? Oh, Ronit, please go on.
Yes, David, I was curious. I'm working on trading financial crisis. I'm working on trading after the financial crisis,
Yes.
Your theories. And I would like to hear your opinion on how does economic crisis can influence on the trends of preemptions that you just discussed about. Is there any influence of this economic crisis on this?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, I would say the big drama in this story, which I didn't mention, is the Trump administration. Okay, so when the Trump administration decided, after you have this strengthening of chemical regulation, 2016, Trump administration decides not to enforce it at all. And so the result is that because of limited preemption, states have been rolling along, and state regulation has actually been increasing because of the lack of federal authority. In appliances, the Trump administration decided cleverly that there would be no strengthening of standards; they'd be frozen. So basically, this set back appliance efficiency of any product which the federal government had already regulated. Cars, the Trump administration, challenged California standards. It's going through the courts. But what's interesting also is that California reached a voluntary agreement with 6 major car companies who agreed to voluntarily adopt California standards in spite of the federal rollback. So the car case, so all these cases sort of show the difference that the federal government makes. And in two of those cases, cars and in chemicals, the relative flexibility given to states allowed state regulation to increase, even though it was shut down by the federal government under Trump. And so I think that's an important point, which is that when you have limited preemption, states can compensate for the weakness of federal authority, which they were able to do in two of those cases, but not in the case of appliance efficiency.
Thank you. More questions? I have one, which goes to the issue of theories of regulation and I guess explanations.
Okay.
Do you hear me? So theories of regulation, and I wonder where to locate your analysis, your explanations in the general theories of public, private, institutional theories of regulation. It seems that it's a bit from all, but you have your own way of putting things together. Can you try to say where are you located? Where do you want to go, or where would you recommend to go in kind of understanding regulation more generally? What can we learn from this story on the politics of regulation?
To learn from this story is that if we want to understand regulatory effectiveness or impact on the world, we need, at least in the American context, and I think in Europe as well, we need to look not only at the stringency of standards, but at the balance of authority, federal-state relations. So I think that my real contribution is to highlight the fact that federal-state, the relative authority between the states and the federal government, or the scope of preemption, has important policy impacts, and more generally, the more states in the US are allowed to exceed federal standards, the more likely you will have innovation, policy learning, and progress. I would say that's my key sort of finding.
What about power in this regard? Would you say that the politics of preemption is a way to weaken business interest, strengthen them? What are the effects of this politics of preemption? And there is another question: what would qualify as a politics of preemption? Is all federal kind of regulation is preemption in a sense?
Not necessarily. I mean, not necessarily at all. It depends. I mean, the federal government can create a floor by which it allows states to enact standards. It can create a framework. There's lots of different variations, okay? I'm interested in a particular dimension of federal authority, which is the role of the federal government in preventing states from enacting more stringent standards. Okay, that's this particular category of federalism, which I'm interested in focusing on. But obviously, there's enormous variation.
Yeah, sure. Would it be useful to take a negative case of unsuccessful case of preemption in your case selection?
Unsuccessful meaning that
there is no politics of preemption. There is somebody is trying to use the federal level to preempt risk regulation, but without success.
That would be the California case, the car emissions case. The industry tries very, very, very hard and loses. And their nightmare was, we're not going to let California run the country. And in fact, that's exactly what has happened. So that's a case in which the industry suffered a major defeat, and it's turned out now, this is 67, it's had a lot of legs, and has had big impact, and has made California the center of automobile emissions innovation, which the industry was worried would happen, and indeed has happened. So that's a case. I mean, so if you compare emissions on one hand, where the industry loses, to GM labeling where the industry wins. Those are two very different cases of industry impact.
Yeah. You were talking about success and relative failure, but you didn't use in the presentation the terms trading up, trading down, race to the bottom, race to the top. In a way, you didn't integrate your kind of major contribution, major terms from the past. Why is that?
Yeah, no, someone had mentioned that earlier with some reviewer. I had a sentence on that. I mean, I mean, I hadn't thought of, I could do that. I mean, I think there is, the car case would show, and the beginning in appliances, there's a partial trading up. In chemicals, the impact of state regulation has had no impact in Washington. The states are all there by themselves regulating chemicals, and the federal government essentially ignores them. And of course, in Vermont, there's a trading down. So I think you could say there's a partial trading up, and I could easily sort of incorporate that.
Yeah, thank you. And I see Dieter wants to ask. So Dieter, please.
Hello, good afternoon from Belfast, Northern Ireland. Just a question about the business influence and business power. Yes. I was wondering whether it would be interesting to know also a little bit more about different sectors within an industry, or with regard to GMO, the relevance of organic farming, for example, in Vermont, yes, which would be pretty much leading in per capita farms in organic farming. So where you have kind of conflicts between different business interests.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The only one of these four cases in which you have local business interests which wanted local state regulation is the GM case. And I think in some ways that hurt the case, because the argument was this is about local protectionism. And you're really not caring about the health and safety of the citizens. You're really just protecting natural farmers. And this is the GM case is the only state in which industry preferences were divided. And interesting enough, it's the one case in which the dominant industry completely wiped out the local guys. So yeah, that's right. I mean, it's the only case in which you do have a division.
But just to follow up, sorry to interrupt you, but just to follow up, what about the industry, the chemical industry? Isn't chemical industry, so in Europe, the chemical industry would be very much divided in green chemistry, green chemical industry, more large companies that do all kind of things, but in the REACH debate, for example, you had quite some conflicts or discourse between Scandinavian companies that were already rather green, and so their main problems as imported, etc., and others that saw a huge threat to growth and economic development. So wouldn't there be also in the US quite some controversies within the chemical sector as such that could explain why there is somehow kind of regulation that is taking into account stricter standards on certain aspects?
That's a good question. I didn't come across any divisions within the chemical industry. The Chemical Manufacturers Association was very unified. It wanted maximum preemption of states. I didn't see any examples of divisions within the industry. I mean, I'm sure there are, but the industry's trade association was very firm. It said we cannot live with all these divergent state standards. We don't trust them. They're too stringent. They're not based on science. We want uniformity. We want, these 30 state standards are driving us crazy. We want uniform standards. The industry, I think, was quite unified and was reasonably pleased by the fact that it did get some increase in preemption. I mean, if you compare the two laws, 76 and 2016, the 16 statute had much more preemption than the earlier statute, and the industry was very pleased with that.
Yep, thank you. Last question, anyone? Jonathan, again, please.
Yeah, maybe I just want to come back on the EU issue, because I just wanted to clarify what I was thinking of, and it really has to do with the question of negative integration and mutual recognition.
Right, right.
And there, the point is that in areas like environmental regulation and food, animal, plant safety, member states are allowed to decline mutual recognition if their own protective standards are higher. And that in turn creates an incentive for producers and member states to seek EU level regulation, but it also puts the member states with high standards in a strong position to demand a leveling up and not a leveling down. So it produces a trading up dynamic. And one could think of this as a sort of reverse preemption kind of logic. So I think it belongs in your in the framework of your analysis. And I mentioned something that you're probably aware of, and is interesting, that for the first time in 2015, the EU tried to resolve deadlocks in an authorization process by returning authority to the member states over GMO cultivation decisions. It allowed them to opt out. And my colleagues, Maria Weimer and Patricia Dombrovska, are studying how this has worked out as part of a Horizon 2020 project we're working on. And what they find, interestingly, is this was supposed to, overcome the deadlock by allowing those member states who wanted to cultivate GMOs to do it and the others not to. But since the authorizations still have to be taken in a comitology committee by all the member states, even the ones who don't want to cultivate it, have not been willing to authorize new GMOs. And so the deadlock is maintained. So this idea of giving the authority back to the states to overcome a deadlock at EU level has turned out not to work out.
Yeah,
at least.
the EM case, I think, is interesting because it's anomaly within Europe, in that you still have lots of states with lots of discretion, a fragmented market. And it's anomaly in the US, in which you have complete preemption, though in a very different way. So that's a very interesting case, I think, in which you do have this extraordinary contrast, in which is the one example, a dramatic example in Europe, where states continue to play an enormous role in disrupting the national market. And it's the one case in which in the US states have no role, have been explicitly prohibited from playing any role whatsoever in regulating genetically modified agricultural labeling. So that's I think, interesting case. I like your longer argument, though, about thinking about, trading up as a reverse preemption. I think that's interesting. And I think you can see cases in which I think the difference in Europe is, because of the fragility, I mean, I've written about this, so I didn't want to write it again, but because of the fragility of the single market and the vulnerability that the member states, will abuse whatever regulatory authority you give them, you do have a pressure like you see in REACH, in which basically member states have more stringent standards, and then they get adopted by Brussels, and they're made uniform. There's preemption. That's an important dynamic. You don't get that as much in the US. In the US, you have states, I think, there are many American states which play a role on regulation on, take, for example, electronic the issue of electronic substances, toxic chemicals and electronics, all that, all those EU directives on electronics. Many American states have enacted those regulations. No European country could ever get away with that. I mean, US states can get away with much more. If you look at a lot of these areas which the EU has harmonized, there's enormous variation in US states. And so I think there's a very different structure in which the fragility of the European market has put pressure on Brussels to harmonize. And those pressures are less important in the US, where there's less of a worry about giving states more authority, which is ironic, of course, because these are just states, while in Europe they're countries. But I think that's a very important difference. I mean, I talked about that a lot in my book, the politics of precaution. So I didn't want to sort of, tell that story again. But I think that's a big difference between Europe and the US.
Thank you very much.
There's much less trading. There's much less trading up in America.
Thank you very much, David, for your fascinating talk. Thank you all for taking part in this seminar. We have tomorrow. We have another seminar on private authority and public policy in the global context, a new special issue of regulation and governance. And on Monday, we are hosting Christopher O'Neill for another talk in this series. So thank you very much all. Thank you very much.
And thank you so many people participating. It's nice to see all these faces of people whom I have known in the past. In person in the past.
Good. So good morning, California. Good afternoon, Boston, and good evening, Europe.
Hello.
See you soon. See you.
Thank you.
Okay.